So now that you have a decent idea on how the routes are mapped to these actions, and we've also talked about the view files, I'm not going to dive too deep into the view files, not because they're not important, but because I have an entire section of the course dedicated to working with the views, and so I don't want to kind of walk through all of that twice because there's so much stuff that we need to cover, and I want to make sure we get to everything in a timely and efficient manner. Just know that pretty much what we've already seen, which is that we have the ability to have a direct mapping between the view file with its action. Now, a very important thing to keep in mind here is the naming is vital. So the way that Rails works is it works on a strong convention side, and there's actually a term for it. It's called convention over configuration, which means that there are a number of settings and things in the background of Rails that simply process, and they do that so that you don't have to manually set up the configuration options. So for example, in the code of Rails, it has a way where it looks for the name of this index action, and then it goes through, it sees that it's for a blog, so it goes and it looks in the blogs directory, and then it goes and it finds the index action, and it knows to pass this variable that was in the controller to this view, so it's available here. If I change this, so let's say that I click rename, and I call this index ASDF. Now if I come here to here and I start the Rails server over again, we're going to get an error. And I want to show you that because I think it's a very important thing to know that that mapping is very important and the naming is very important. So if I hit return right now, you can see that blogs controller index is missing a template for this request format and variant, which means that, in other words, it looked for a file that said index.html and it couldn't find it. So the way that you fix that is you simply go back and change and rename it. I wanted to include that because I have seen some students that didn't realize how important that was, and they had some names that were different, and that was throwing some errors. So that is our blogs view. Now we also have the concept of layouts. Now layouts are something that we're going to get into in quite a bit more detail later on, and I'm going to show you not only how to work with the main application layout file, but also how you can create multiple layout files and use them based on what type of page is being viewed. So for right now, just know that this is the funnel that all of the view items are getting passed through. So each one of those items, so whether it was blog new or blog edit, it was actually being called and rendered right inside of here. But that's all I'm going to say on it right now because I have an entire section dedicated to layouts, and so I want to keep that for that section. Moving down, the bin directory is something that I do not think you will ever use possibly in your career. I do not remember the last time I had to ever make any changes on there. This is where the binaries for the system are kept. No reason to make any changes. Config, this is very different. You will be working in the config directory quite a bit. There are a number of things such as your environments directory. This is where you keep settings that are specific to your environments. The creators of Rails, one of their big motivating factors originally, and this was about well over a decade ago, about 12, 13 years ago, when they were creating Rails, they had an issue where they wanted to have different settings for different environments. So in other words, they may want to have one mail server that was in their development system, and your development, what these stand for, if you've never heard of the concept of environments are your production, your development, and those kind of things, which means your development environment is usually what you're using locally. So as we go and we navigate and we have our system running just like we have right here, we're in development mode. When we push this up to a server, like we will later on, then this means we're in production mode. And you can see there are a number of changes here, such as how it handles caching, how it compresses JavaScript files. And you don't have to know what all of these things mean. The more important thing is I just want you to understand that there is different settings based on the environment that the application's running in. And then lastly, we have test, which we're not going to get into test in this course, but what tests do is it gives you the ability to have another environment that all your tests can run in. Moving down are initializers. Initializers are very cool. What they are code files that will run before your application starts up. So let's pretend that you have a connection to an API, like you want to go and connect to the Google Maps API, and you need to set that connection before your application starts up. You could set that right here in your initializers, because all of these are going to run before your application gets running, and all of those items will be set. There are all kinds of things here, such as being able to set your assets, and we're going to get into how we can customize this later on, so we can do things like store videos and do some different things like that. You also have the ability to customize inflections. So something that Rails does is very cool, is it has some custom ways of working with plural and singular words. So if you remember, when we ran our generator, we created something called a blog. We did not call it blogs with an S. We called it a blog scaffold. But notice, if you come to the controller, it calls this the blogs controller, and it knows that we're talking about blogs here. So the way that that works is based off of how the inflections work in Rails, which means that it can understand when you are using plural or singular words. For this very reason, I usually like to keep very simple words for my generators, for my models and controllers, to make it very clear. However, if there are times where Rails doesn't understand if something is plural or singular, or it's setting it up wrong, you can actually override some of the defaults. So a great example here is they show you how you could override ox, and they show how you could override person or fish or sheep or anything like that. Not something that we're going to get into this course. In fact, it's not something I have done more than a handful of times in my career, but that is there and it is available to you. There's some other things such as MIME types, something like having rich text available, new framework defaults. These are things that are new in Rails 5. Specifically, one of the things I really like is how to preserve time zones and some things like that. Has a session store by default. This is where all of your cookies for the application are, and this is kind of the basic one. We also could override this if we wanted to have a more robust one, such as keeping all of our cookies in a Redis database or something like that. We're going to get into Redis later, but we're not going to override the default cookie store. I think for 99% of cases this usually works perfectly fine. There's some other items here. Any of them that we're going to actually get into, we are going to get into them later, and we're going to actually dive into how they work and how to customize them. One of the couple last ones that I want to show you, application.rb. This is your main application file. If you're coming from a language that has the concept of a main function or something like that, this is what you could essentially think of this being. So your application.rb file is where all of the magic happens. This is where everything starts, everything loads up, everything is going to start. You require Rails, you have all of these Rails frameworks that are built into the system, and you can add any kinds of custom things that you need in your application RB file. This, if you think of this, you can think of this almost as the master over all of these initializers that start up. So this is something that we'll get into a little bit in learning how to customize it later on. Few last things. You have your secrets file right here. Now, your secrets are very cool because they give you the ability to have security in your application. So you have all kinds of different things you could put here. Right now, it's just the secret key base, but we could put API keys in here. We could put anything that we need to be able to access securely and not push to places like GitHub. These are going to be things that only you in the application, as you have it locally, will need to be able to access. One last thing in the config directory I want to cover is, I already showed you routes. I want to show you the database file, because this is something that there are a few times where I've had to work with students and get this fixed. So there are times where, say you forgot to do the Postgres database flag when we created the application. You might have an adapter that says SQLite 3 right here, or say you wanted to use MySQL instead. This is where you would create those settings. You also have the ability to do things such as set a username and password for the database, and this is where you name all of your tables. If you've been following along, then you shouldn't have to make any changes to this throughout this entire course, and you should be perfectly fine. However, if you made some mistakes in the beginning, then you're going to have to update it, and updating it so it works just like this should be all that you need to do. So that's everything that we need to cover right now in the config directory. A few remaining ones we've already talked about. Database, this contains our migrations, our schema file, and then our seeds. This is how we're going to give some fake data that we can work with, or some sample data that we can work with in the browser. We're going to get later into the lib directory. This is where we put custom rake tasks and any custom algorithms that we don't want to have inside of the application itself. Then we have log files. This is where some of our error messages and just where our log files are kept. And then some of these other directories, you will probably not have, you definitely won't have to deal with them inside of this application, and you rarely are going to use them in other applications. Some of these are older, they were used in previous version of Rails, so we keep them, but we don't really use these very much. This used to be kind of where you would store assets and those kind of things, but nowadays those are pretty much always kept in your assets directory. So that is your comprehensive dive deep into the file system. We walk through how the scaffold generated all of that functionality, and I hope now that some of the magic is gone. Not in a bad sense. Rails magic is awesome, but I hope that the magic is gone in the sense that you know now, or you at least have a better idea on how all of that functionality was built in. There is nothing hidden behind the scenes that's making it happen. The majority of the things we saw for the scaffold are all happening because of what's going on here in the controller and how its corresponding connection to the views and everything like that. So I hope that gives you a better idea on how that works, and you now have a little bit better idea on how the flow and processes work in Rails 5.